Join the stars of the Ancient Aliens TV show, Eric Von Doniken, as he returns to Manchester after an amazing response to his last presentation. David Childress will guide you through the evidence left behind. Mike Barrow will take you to other worlds, where Nick Pope will present the real X-Files. Paula Harris will share incredible testimonies. It's time to believe and raise consciousness. Join like-minded souls on Saturday, June 23rd, 2018 for Awakening. What do you believe?
Broadcasting from the UK and across the world online. You're now watching The Kevin Moore Show, and I'm about to be joined by my guest, Kevin Randle. Now, Kevin is a retired intelligence colonel who served in Vietnam as a helicopter pilot and in Iraq as a battalion intelligence officer. Now, he began writing for UFO magazines and eventually moved into books and has written over 100 books on the subject. Now, he joins me today to discuss his latest book, Encounter in the Desert, and more. Kevin Randle, welcome to the show.
It's nice to be in England.
It's nice to be back in America.
Did I rat you out there?
Well, yeah. England's an okay place to be right now. I would rather be in America. I can't believe I'm going to be there very soon. I'm so grateful for you coming on, Kevin. I've got to say that because I have tried to get hold of you for ages. Do you know that?
No, I did not know that.
No, you did not know that. On your website, there is no way to contact you on there, on your blog website.
Yes.
And I had to ask favors in the end from the UFO community.
Yes, Philip Mantle ratted me out.
Yes, he did.
The reason there's no contact information on the blog is because there's a lot of people who do not subscribe to my opinions on UFOs. So I get some very nasty emails, so I just kind of avoid that by not having contact information on the blog.
Yes, that's now I can completely understand you there. I'm just grateful to get you on, and you've done some fantastic work in this field as well. So if you want to do snappy answers on some of these questions, we've got a lot of things to cover here. This is going to be an interview, but a bit of a talk as well, okay? But let's just get straight into it, because I just want to get your background in for those who haven't heard of you before, and how dare they.
Yeah, I was going to say, there's people that haven't heard of me. I'm stunned. Stunned.
Well, you know, on this show, we cover a lot of consciousness subjects as well. Well, you know, I'm trying to diversify the show, that it covers a lot of different subjects, but this has always been one of my kind of passions that got us into doing the show in the first place, the ufology subjects. And how many years in your career have you been studying ufology?
I usually say I go back around 50 years. I started looking at the UFO phenomenon when I was a teenager in high school. I'd read one of Brad Steiger's books, Strangers in the Sky. I'd always been interested prior to that, but that kind of launched things. And so I'd been studying it and talking to people since I was 18 years old. So it's around 50 years that I've been looking at it.
50 years. Now, you had a career in the military as well?
After high school, I was in the U.S. Army. I was a helicopter pilot. Once I got done with that, discharged from the Army, I went to college, went to ROTC for some bizarre reason, spent some years on active duty in the Air Force and Air Force Reserve, and then I was in the Iowa National Guard when we were all deployed to Iraq. So I've had a career that spans 40 years in the military, but it's not all in one long line. There's been breaks in the military service.
Absolutely. Now, we're just about to come back to your military as well, but to be a full-time I'm gonna coin this term for you to be a full-time, investigator into ufology. Obviously, your day-to-day livings and everything have come from writing books. I would have thought that's one way of bringing an income in for yourself.
That magazine articles. At one point in the mid 1970s, there was like a half dozen magazines in the United States that published UFO stories, and I was making a very good living just writing those articles. In fact, I kid people about going to college on what I called the Saga scholarships. Saga was a men's magazine, but they also had a column on UFOs monthly, and then they started UFO Report, and they paid enough money for an article that almost covered my tuition at the University of Iowa at the time. So I would write one story for them every semester so I could pay my tuition. So I call that my Saga scholarship. But you could make a good living just by doing the UFO stories, and was able to convince enough people that I was good at what I was doing, or at least competent at what I was doing, that they would pay me. They would call me and say, "Can you do a story on such and such?" And I would say, "But of course I can." One of the things that was kind of funny is in ROTC, Air Force ROTC, we would get press releases from the Air Force, and everybody knew of my interest in UFOs. And one of the press releases said that the Project Blue Book files were now available for public scrutiny at Maxwell Air Force Base, but that was just released to military organizations. And I called the editor at Saga and said, I've got some information I'd like to talk to you about. And they said, well, he's not available. Can he call you back? And I said, yeah, just tell him I can get in the Project Blue Book files. And within minutes, he called back and was giving me all kinds of questions to try to answer and that sort of thing. So I was able to kind of, precipitate an assignment to go to Maxwell Air Force Base. So Robert Cornett, a friend of mine, and I went down there and spent a week going through the Project Blue Book files, practically before any other civilians had an opportunity to see them. And then, of course, they were moved to the National Archives in microfilm, so you could buy the microfilms. But, that was kind of how I was able to sort of do full-time UFO investigations periodically, and I had other jobs and other things I did in between time. So it wasn't that I was just doing UFO research full-time. When I had an opportunity, I was doing it. And when I didn't have an opportunity, I was doing something else.
What was the one thing that has kept you to this point in this field? What is it? What is the inner exploration for yourself in all this?
I'd like to get the definitive answer. Are we being visited by alien creatures? And the problem is, at this point, we do not have the definitive answer. We have a lot of interesting circumstantial evidence. Skeptics will say, well, they're not seen on radar. And I'm thinking, doesn't our stealth technology kind of negate that criticism now, even though we have a lot of good radar cases out there? What about photographs? Well, we have some very good photographs, but they were all taken in the 1950s. For example, in today's world, there's UFO photographs all over the internet, but 99% of them are faked. But looking for that, trying to put together the scientific evidence that we're being visited. I know a lot of my colleagues say, if we went into a court of law, we have the preponderance of evidence on our side. And I'm thinking, yeah, but that's not the scientific standard. We want the scientific evidence. What can we present that can be quantified by the scientific community? What kind of evidence do we need to do that? And even though we're kind of waiting for the UFOs to appear so that we can do the research, there are things that can be done once they appear to gather that sort of scientific evidence. And in the time that we've been investigating, and I say we meaning everybody since the 1940s, we've been very sloppy in gathering the evidence properly. And I think we need to upgrade our gathering of the evidence and the presentation of the evidence.
Okay, if that came out at some point within our lifetimes, right, that we had been visited, there was evidence to say that there had been interactions, what would that do for mankind, do you think?
It really depends on the contact. If it was through radio astronomy, for example, there's really not a lot that we can do unless they're feeding us all kinds of really great stuff by radio astronomy that we can understand. If they landed and just said, here we are, again, we look at it from the point of view, these things have been around for 50, 60 years at least. It has not affected me in any way, shape, or form, other than providing me with an area of research, I guess. But I mean, it hasn't negatively affected my life, and I don't think it would negatively affect anybody else's life. So it'd be pretty blasé once we realized they've been around for that kind of a period. If they showed up and started giving us all kinds of stuff, we know that when a technologically inferior civilization comes in contact with a technologically superior civilization, the technologically inferior civilization ceases to exist. Not necessarily through contact, but the introduction of that technology, and I wish I could say technology for some reason, often affects the way they interact with themselves. And the best example was in anthropology, where a fellow was studying an ancient tribe, or not an ancient tribe, but a tribe, a faraway tribe, not connected to modern technology, I guess. And he would induce the inhabitants to talk to him by giving them steel axes. What he didn't realize is he was undermining their social structure, because in the past, to get use of an axe, you had to go to a headman, and he had a stone axe, which is certainly not as good as a steel axe, and he just undermined the social underpinnings of that civilization because he didn't understand it. But what that demonstrates is how the technology can do that sort of thing. So if they provide us with a source of creating unlimited energy cheaply, we've killed off the oil industry. If they give us metal with a memory, for example, we can build cars out of it. So the next time you have a fender bender, you back up and the metal goes back to its original shape. You've killed off a great number of collision garages that straighten that stuff out. But you can look at it through the whole thing. Electricity would become easily obtainable, and you no longer have to worry about the power company providing it to you. So you've kind of destroyed some of the economics of the civilization, maybe inadvertently, but that's what you've done. So you have to look at what you're talking about when you're saying, well, we have contact, and what would it mean?
Absolutely. And do you think within the community as well, if you refer researchers, that that the researchers come together enough, or do you think it's quite a sort of divided community nowadays?
At this point, it's extremely divided. I mean, it's very fractured, and there's really no universal leadership in it. Everybody's kind of out for themselves, depending on what their agenda is and what their stories are. And we get inundated with charlatans telling fantastic stories, and they have no proof. They claim military experience, for example, and they say, well, we can't find your records. And they say, well, yeah, the government's hiding those to make us look bad, which is absolute nonsense. If you wanted to challenge my military record, for example, I could produce literally hundreds of documents that I obtained over my military experience. Dumb things like travel vouchers, which we have to fill out when we went on TD2I, copies of orders, copies of OERs, all kinds of documentation. So if the government said, well, we can't find his file, I can produce all those documents, and they can be verified through other sources. So we have a problem with that. So the community is very fractured. And I think if it came out, then people would be arguing about, well, these aren't the people I was in contact with, or the creatures I was in contact with, or there's others out there that I've been in contact with, so this doesn't negate what I'm saying. So I think it would still remain fractured. In the UFO community, it seems that no matter what you present in the way of evidence, if I come out and say a case is bogus, let's take the Charles Whitted case. These were the airline pilots in 1948 that saw a cigar-shaped craft with windows on it flash by their aircraft. And people were thinking, this is a great report. I mean, we got qualified observers. They're airline pilots.
Right.
They're flying
Absolutely.
their aircraft.
Mm-hmm.
They see this cigar-shaped craft. A wonderful sighting. It induced partly induced the Air Force to create their estimate of the situation because of that sighting. Then we look at the Zond 4 reentry in 1964 or 68. I can't remember. I think it was 64, 68. The Soviet spacecraft returning. And we had a number of people who did not realize what it was, and they were drawing pictures of cigar-shaped craft that mimicked those drawn by Charles Whitted. I'm thinking, okay, what did Charles Whitted see? Well, obviously it wasn't Soviet-manufactured spacecraft, but it was a meteor. And you look at some of the video we now have of meteor falls that could explain it completely. And I say that, and people just become hostile. How can you do that? How can you say you're just nothing but a debunker? You work for the CIA, you work for the FBI, you work for Hector Quintanilla.
Right. Well, actually, let's just get you just to state that you do believe that there are something that's been visiting our planet for maybe ever. Yeah, I'm putting words in your mouth. You just tell us your views on that there is something legitimate in all the research that you've done. There are legitimate cases.
I can break it down in a couple of ways about that. I look at some sightings, the Levelland, Texas in 1957, for example, craft interacting with the environment, multiple witnesses at multiple locations independently reporting what they had seen and how the spacecraft interacted with their cars. Wonderful sighting that I don't think has gotten enough attention. This seems to suggest an alien presence. Does it prove an alien presence? Absolutely not. And that's the difference. I believe there's been an alien presence. I believe there's been alien visitation. If you raise the bar of evidence to the point of scientific evidence, we're not there yet. If you go to a courtroom and say, do we have the preponderance of the evidence? I think we can make the case in that respect. But we do not have that one thing that allows us to say, we have been visited. Here is proof positive that will be accepted by the majority of the scientific community. Because there's always going to be those people who disagree with you no matter what the evidence shows.
Of course, 100%. So what would you say? You mentioned a case there, but if there was one case you were going to choose, you've been asked this before probably, what is that one case that you would say, well, this stands up?
Levelland, Texas.
Right.
Because of the multiple witnesses, because of the multiple independent witnesses, because there is a suggestion that there was landing traces that were not properly gathered. And what happened in this case is the Air Force got into a public fight with NICAP, the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomenon, which was a civilian organization, over the validity of the case. The Air Force saying, well, there were only 3 witnesses, NICAP saying there were 9 witnesses, and somebody's lying in all of this. And it kind of hid the evidence that could have been gathered at that time. And what really is hilarious about that is both sides were wrong. If you go back to the Blue Book files and everything, you can find witnesses at 13 separate locations who saw it. So it wasn't 3, it wasn't 9, it was actually a lot more. But nobody gathered the proper evidence at that time. And that's what's been hurting the UFO community since the very beginning, is the lack of any kind of mythology to collect the evidence.
But then you've seen, all the years that you've been doing this as well, you've seen a massive change in the new UFO people, researchers coming forward now, where it's not just nuts and bolts, it's very much gone into the area of consciousness.
There's always sort of been that aspect of it. There were the contactees in the 50s, for example, the guys who claimed, and I say guys, there were a few women, but the guys who claimed that they had met the alien creatures and been on their spacecraft and traveled to their planets. I think George Adamski claimed he went to Venus. If Adamski was alive today, I'd say, why didn't the spacecraft melt? But that's just me. But you've always had these subsets. The contactees, we have the abduction phenomena, we have the cattle mutilations, we have the crop circles, we have the MJ-12 documents, we have the crash retrievals, all kind of fragmenting the UFO phenomena. And we do get into an awful lot, I'm not sure it's any more so today, of the New Age aspect of it. When Don Schmidt and I made our first trip to New Mexico in 1989 to look into the Roswell case, we had a meeting with a group of people in Albuquerque that were supposedly knowledgeable about this, and it turned out they were basically into the mental telepathy and the channeling of the alien creatures. It didn't help our research at all because we're looking for nuts and bolts in Roswell, and they're talking about something that can't be really validated in any sense. So we've always had that sort of thing going on, and I'm not sure. You can look at the internet and you can find there any avenue you want to pursue in great depth, and I think maybe it's just an opening of that avenue of communication that we didn't have 20 years ago. No matter what I want to look up, I wanted to answer a question the other day. A bizarre question is, what was the circulation of coins in the 17th century like? Did people hang on to them for a long time? So if you found a coin from 1650, did that mean that that coin was dropped in 1650 in that location, or did somebody in 1670 or 1700 drop the coin in that location? But you can look up these really esoteric things on the internet and usually find an answer.
And we're going to get back to the internet in a minute with YouTube and everything else, because there's a question for that. But just staying on this line of discussion, then, I mean, there's those out there that talk about these beings maybe being interdimensional, right? Potentially.
I think John Keel proposed that back in the 1960s. And there's been a number of talks about that. My personal belief, I think, is the best way to frame this is I believe that the answer is going to be extraterrestrial. It's going to be alien. But that does not mean there isn't the interdimensional answer that might turn out to be the correct one. Or time travel. Somebody from the Earth's futures come back and that are responsible for the UFO sightings. I think those answers are less likely, but they've been out there almost from the very beginning as well.
Yeah, it's nothing new. That's what you're saying. That's what you're saying.
Yes.
And it does make me think sometimes, what if it's maybe a combination of what you've just said there, the answer to what this phenomena is, or what if it's none of that, and actually it's even much bigger than that, and what we think it is, it actually isn't, which is not helping anything in this discussion really, but I'm saying think outside what we think we might think it is, or what we know it is, or what we presume it could be. What if it's more than nuts and bolts? What if it's more than consciousness? What if it's something else? It's part of the makeup of this reality.
Well, yeah, there's always that possibility. It could be that it's some kind of mass psychological problem that we don't understand, that we communicate to one another, and which we can communicate to one another better through the internet and the way we interact today than we did 20 years ago. It could be the inner Earth. There really is an inner Earth, and they're coming back. It could be that there was ancient civilizations, and by ancient, I'm not talking 10,000, 20,000 years ago. I'm talking millions of years ago that, for whatever reason, had to leave the Earth. And now they're coming back to see what has happened there. Think of the dinosaurs and the mass extinction 65 million years ago. What if that forced an intelligence or a civilization to abandon the planet for whatever reason, and now they're coming back to Earth? I mean, there's all kinds of possible explanations for what it is. I tend towards the nuts and bolts simply because that seems to be where the preponderance of the evidence is. But there are other things that suggest maybe some of these other answers are correct.
And sometimes, the simpler answer is more lurking towards the truth as well.
Absolutely. To me, the more logical answer is alien visitation. But that doesn't necessarily rule out the other answers. And when you start talking about Occam's razor, one of the things people always say, the simplest answer is the correct one, but they always forget it's the simplest answer that covers all the evidence. Not just the simplest answer, but it has to cover the evidence as well. And so that may take you away from the simplest answer to one that is a little more complex, but it covers all of the evidence that we've been able to gather.
So what's your take then on a potential secret space program?
I will laugh hysterically in just a moment. I don't think there's any evidence. I have been accused, myself personally, of having been deployed to Mars to fight in this great war that's taking place amongst the stars. And that the cover was we were going to Iraq to participate in Iraqi freedom. We really went to Mars, and when we come back, we, of course, were debriefed in such a way as we have no memory of Mars, and the Iraqi memories were implanted in our brains. I don't know how they implanted the 2,000 photographs I have in my camera, but that's okay. Nor do they explain how I was able to communicate on a daily basis with my wife in real time and all those kinds of things. But no, I don't think. I'm just, it's guys saying, yeah, I participated in this secret space program, but I have no evidence to prove it.
That's the problem, isn't it? And I mean, I was listening back to a Richard Dolan interview not too long ago. He does pertain towards that there could be a secret space program, that budgets could have been funded towards that, but maybe it's not the secret space program as we would like it to be. Maybe it's much more simpler. You know, there's spy satellites up there. That's all it bloody is. You know, we're not going to secret bases on the moon or going to bloody Mars. Do you know what I mean? It is literally, we are spying on each other.
Oh, absolutely. We're spying on each other. We know that. And we know there's black budgets that cover this sort of thing. But I think Richard, separating it in a very intelligent way by saying that, the secret space program doesn't include these guys on Mars fighting, abducted from their beds and taken to Mars to fight for 20 years and then put back in their beds 15 minutes later type thing.
Unless they're going off into different parallel realities. And then, when they've gone to, they're, and that just seems, I know, a bit far-fetched for some people, but, who knows, right? But it does seem a bit.
Well, the difference is when I say something about a UFO sighting, even though it might seem far out, people seeing the creatures, there's evidence I can produce that proves that. If people question my military background, they can go to the National Archives in St. Louis and request my records and find out that I'm telling the truth about that sort of thing. But these people don't have any records, and the excuse is, well, my records are hidden, they're secret, but they have nothing to prove the case. And until they can come up with some evidence, we reject it.
And how could someone come on to say that they've gone through this without having some reprimand for that? Yet, I hold up the book The Day After Roswell, and, there's the guy called Philip Corsell that, apparently had, that there was real information mixed within maybe false information in this, right? But there was some truth to some of this stuff. But then again, you may have a different take on that.
Well, first of all, the front cover lies, because he wasn't a colonel. He was a lieutenant colonel. He never got promoted to colonel. Right. And I've had a similar situation. My first UFO book was the UFO Case Book, and it said by Captain Kevin D. Randall, U.S. Air Force, retired. The problem was the editor thought the R at USAFR meant retired, didn't realize it meant reserve. And people would question me on that. How can you be retired at your young age? And actually, when the book came out, if I'd stayed in the military from the point I joined it, I could have been retired. But Corsell could have said, well, that was a mistake that the publisher made. Instead, he doubled down on it and said, yes, I was promoted colonel when I retired. Well, there's no evidence of that. But the problem is there's nothing in his book that wasn't already on the internet in some fashion. And there's any number of mistakes in the book that if he'd done his research a little bit better, he would have known that these things were untrue and could have avoided that. So his book is, I think, based on his desire to get into and get a book published about what a great guy he was, because he helped fund or feed the Roswell debris into an industry.
It seems a bit nutty. It's almost like then he had a mental health issue to want to do that. Because there's some normal part of us that would say, this isn't right. I need to just, to go down that road that lies upon lies upon lies. I mean, that don't seem very sane to me, but what do I know?
On the other side of that coin, there's a book called Stolen Valor, and it talks about people who claim to be Vietnam veterans who never served in country, never served in the military, never left the United States. What we learned in there, and according to the book, during a survey, I think it was in 1995, there was a question that was asked, are you a Vietnam veteran? 13 million people said yes. There were at the time, I think, 2.8 million Vietnam veterans. In other words, 11 million people were lying about their Vietnam service on this census form that nobody was going to see.
Wow.
What would motivate you to do that? And we can go, there was a judge in Chicago who claimed to have been awarded the Medal of Honor, had it on his wall and everything else, was eventually exposed as lying about it. Well, he was a judge. Could
someone like this, could it have been the case they've taken someone else's story, that the story is true in the most tiniest ways, in the most, there is tiny bits of truth in there, but it's not his, could it have been not his truth?
Well, it's obviously not his truth. It's clear to me. It's clear to me that what he had done was he had gathered a lot of information, not necessarily on the internet, but gathered a lot of information that had been published and broadcast about the Roswell case and plugged himself into it. And we've seen that many times in other cases. There at the turn of the last century, there were carnivals going around the United States, and there were 15 guys claiming to be the real Jesse James. 14 of them were lying. Actually, all 15 were, but you knew 14 of them had to be lying.
But then, you know, his son's going to be the one, Corso's son's going to be the one that had to carry a lot of that when Corso passed on. And I'm sure there was something with the Corso's son saying that, you know, yeah, there was, you know, there'd be, you know, presidents calling up sometimes on the phone line at home or wherever they were based, and that, that this wasn't a normal father. This was a high-ranking person, but I'm just going on from hearsay of what I've heard, and I was going to try, when I go to America this time, try to interview his son. But then why would his son make up the where's the money? Where's the money? That's what I always say in that.
Well, in the royalties from the book, but I think the difference is the children often don't know exactly what's going on. There was I think it was a stockbroker who claimed that he was a secret CIA agent. And the secretary would say he would sometimes, during the first Gulf War, they would hear him on the phone screaming at people about what was going on and what was happening overseas and how he was guiding these things. And supposedly calls were coming in from Washington, D.C. The secretary said, well, yeah, I heard all of this stuff. Of course, the guy was making it up. The publisher, and I forget which newspaper, one of the Phoenix newspapers, and I don't remember which one it was, the publisher claimed to have been a fighter pilot, and he would show up to formal dinners in full Air Force regalia. Never been in the Air Force.
Incredible.
Why would he do this? But the point is, the children would think that he had done that because of the stories he told them, and they would have no reason to doubt that.
So why do people get so attached to these liars and, you know, won't just have a balanced view of like, well, maybe it's true. I have to balance it out with, I don't have the evidence. But, you know, let me try to use a little bit of level-headedness here and not get so attached to someone else's story. Why does that happen?
Well, if it's a relative, you have the desire to believe the relative is telling you the truth. You don't want to call your father, your grandfather, your uncle, your mother a liar.
I just meant the public listening to these stories. I meant the bigger, wider public that gets so attached to these kind of stories and will call you out for being the problem.
I think they get attached to the stories is because of their will to believe. They want to believe these things, and it fulfills some psychological need in them. They want to believe these sorts of things, so they become attached to the stories, and they don't want to hear that the person who is spinning this story that they become attached to for whatever reason is not being as truthful as he or she may be. And so that is why they defend them, and they don't want to listen to the counter evidence. I got a really nasty email just the other day from some guy wanted just outraged that I would not open my mind to the possibility these stories were true. And I'm thinking, yeah, if you had some evidence, I'm on board. But you cannot say this, that, and the other thing simply because it puts you in the spotlight, and now these people want to believe what you're telling them about it. And I don't know what kind of a psychological need it might fulfill in them, but it certainly does that.
Well, you see, I'm doing a documentary on channeling, right? Now, there's none of this is provable, right? But the nice thing that it does do is it does give some solutions into the sense of, you know, how to be a better you, you know, how to come, you know, love is the only answer, oneness is what we're looking for, right? You know, it's not going out claiming things like some of the people that we can mention. I'll mention some names, right? Corey Goode, David Wilcock, right? Why not? And there's others out there as well. But these are I'm primarily just mentioning them right now because they're the most famous ones where people have a real divided opinion about, right? Well, you know, I mean, I guess there's no evidence for their stories yet. And their stories have divided the community quite badly. Well, not Corey's story, not Wilcock's.
Well, you can say the same thing about the Billy Meier.
Of course, Billy Meier. Yeah, there's another one. Yep.
And that has really divided the community, and he has a number of defenders that are shall we say, very enthusiastic in defending him, and will challenge anybody that suggests that maybe Billy Meyer isn't quite as honest as he could be.
Oh God, it's Billy
And
Meyer
they
is
will
the
just
only
go
way.
nuts.
It's Billy Meyer is the only
Yes.
way. Yeah, and the proponent of that is the guy in the US as well. I'm not going to mention his names because he's pretty can get a bit wild. But yes, Billy Meyer.
That's a nice way of putting it.
Yeah.
Well, but and you look at the stuff, and you find a hole in part of his story, and you point it out, and they come up with some kind of nonsensical excuse. And what I think about is some of the pictures that he had presented that have turned out to be faked. And they say, well, yeah, Billy Meyer didn't take those pictures. Well, you said he did originally. Well, you see, the government, the men in black, have switched the pictures so they would be easily discredited, and it's all a plot to discredit Billy Meyer.
Well, what if the case was that there were some authentic stuff within the Billy Meyer case, but then you get this occultness with the material, and it becomes like, they are going to save us, where really that's not they're the only answer. That's when it gets weird, where this is the only answer. Anything else is not to be looked at. We have the answer here. That reminds me very much of religion.
The thing about the contactees back in the 50s is they would not call each other out. George Adamski, I think, was going to Venus, and George Van Tassel was going to Mars. And Van Tassel would not say Adamski is a liar, and vice versa. What they would say is, Van Tassel would say, well, you can't believe anything those Venetians say. So he's saying that the Venetians are not telling the truth. Or Adamski would say, well, those Martians are not to be trusted. But they wouldn't call each other out. And in today's world, the attacks become personal. It's not that you've made a mistake or you're in error or there's a problem here. It's you're a bad person because you do not believe this person's story to be true. You have to embrace it all, or you're basically on the outside. And I've seen that any number of times, where you have to embrace everything in the UFO community, regardless of how ridiculous the case may be, or the story might be, or the person might be. If you do not endorse it, then you are an outsider and obviously a debunker and a stooge of the CIA.
And why can't we all just get on? If we don't all believe Corey's story, why can't Corey? I bet Corey's a really nice guy. I bet if I met him, he's a really nice person, right? I've been told that he is, right? But do I believe his story, all of his story? No, absolutely not. But why? But are we not allowed to have different opinions? Isn't that just okay?
No, not in today's environment. It certainly is not, and it goes far beyond just the UFO field. It gets really nasty in the arena of politics.
Oh God, yeah.
Where if you express a contrary opinion, you're attacked physically for it. Which is absolutely preposterous. I might not agree with your political opinions. You have the right to hold those. I have the right to hold mine. In the UFO community, you ask my opinion about a specific case, and I give it to you, and you say, no, that's not right. Well, yeah, it is right, because that's my opinion. You can change my opinion by providing me with some evidence, but telling me, no, I'm wrong is not going to do that. You have to provide the evidence. And I'll look at the evidence. I came out a long time ago suggesting that cattle mutilations are terrestrially based. It's a terrestrial phenomenon. And people say, well, you're wrong, you're wrong. I periodically review the information in cattle mutilations and other aspects of the UFO community where I've expressed an opinion to make sure the situation hasn't been radically altered, that some new evidence hasn't been presented that would force me to reevaluate a position. So that's something that I do, but it seems too often in the UFO community we take a position and that's it. That's the position we're going to defend no matter what evidence is presented to us or what we see in the future.
Yeah, I'm probably going to get a lot of heat on this conversation, in the comments below for the things I've said. I'll be called, negative for looking at things this way. I'm not. I'm just trying to be realistic about where we are as a community as well. That like I've said before, I think it's perfectly okay to have different opinions. But let's not, the people that observe the different opinions are the worst ones, where they get very heated about having a different opinion sometimes because you're rocking their boat on their truth. God, it's a bit religious-like, isn't it? In a sense, in that way.
Well, I was going to say, I'm not sure why it is necessary for me to validate their opinions. And I think that's one of the problems we run into. People say, what do you think about such and such? And they're hoping that I will validate their opinion in some cases. Well, yeah, I believe that completely and totally. And then I suggest, well, no, there's some real problems with this. And I think Corso is a prime example. You know, people say, what do you think of Philip Corso? I loved his book. Well, you might have loved his book, but unfortunately, it has some holes in it. And they don't want to hear that. They want to say, yes, I believe Philip Corso completely and totally. And when we're looking at something like this, I think that we need to have a diversity of opinion about it. My opinion might be totally wrong. I can point to the things in Corso's book, for example, that are inaccurate. I can point to things in my own book on Roswell, my Roswell books, where things are wrong. I did a book, Roswell in the 21st Century, trying to move the debate from where it had been into a different arena because the gathering of new evidence and the finding of new sources enables us to do that sort of thing. So we have to be ready, willing, and able to reevaluate our opinions. Too often the people don't want to do that. They merely want validation for what they truly believe. They don't want to go where the evidence takes them.
And do you ever really look at other people's research in this field?
Oh, absolutely. You'd be dumb not to. If you're going to have an educated opinion of what's going on in this field, you have to look at everything. I used to be a great proponent of the Bermuda Triangle because of the mystery of the disappearances there. And then I read a book by Lawrence Kusch called The Bermuda Triangle Solved. And I bought the book thinking, if I'm going to debate the topic, I have to know what the enemy's point of view is, the enemy being the skeptic in this case. And read his book, and he convinced me that he was right. I had an opportunity when I was in the Air Force Reserve. Our parent unit was the 440th Tactical Airlift Wing out of Milwaukee. They lost an airplane in the Bermuda Triangle, and you see that case in many of the books about the Bermuda Triangle. I asked him one day about that, the operations officer, and he said, oh, yeah, it didn't disappear. It crashed into the ocean. We found some of the wreckage. You want to see it? We got it down in the hangar. I always regret I didn't A, have my camera with me, and B, go down to the hangar to photograph the wreckage. But they found things with the serial numbers from the aircraft on it and the like. So they know what happened to the airplane, yet that's part of the Bermuda Triangle. The point simply is I was looking, as you said, at the opposition's work on this to see what they had come up with, and it was such a well-done piece of research, it convinced me totally.
I think one of the problems is as well that there's YouTube channels out there nowadays that are apparently interviewing whistleblowers. I mean, I've never had a whistleblower come to me since doing this show. Do you know that? I've never had one. Now, either I'm a shit host, which I'm okay with, and they don't like my show, right? Or they know something about the future where this show's not even there, so why bother? Or something about this where people are interviewing whistleblowers are faked. They're fake. They're doing it for the views.
When I was doing my radio show on the X-Zone Broadcast Network, I approached a number of people to come on the show. And one of the guys said, no, I'm not going to do it because I don't want to promote your show. And I'm thinking, I'm not promoting my show, it's promoting your book. I may ask you some tough questions. You know I'm going to ask you some tough questions, and you may not have the answers for them, and that's why you refuse to go on the show. I've had other people who have come on the show, and I've asked them the tough questions, and they've given me answers, and I've challenged them on the answers to get to it. The best example is Ben Moss and Tony Angiola, which inspired my book, Encounter in the Desert, about the Socorro case, but they were on my program talking about Socorro. And Ben Moss said at one point that 3 people had seen or heard the object in the sky on the day that Lonnie Zamora saw the landing in Socorro, and had called the police department about that. And I said, did you check the police files, the police records on that? And I asked them 3 times, and I never got a satisfactory answer. Well, that inspired me to look deeper into the case. And what happened was, going through the Project Blue Book files, I came to a report written by Captain Richard Holder, who was an Army officer who was there really within a matter of minutes, or we're talking an hour and a half, 90 minutes, of the landing, interviewing Zamora. And in his report he wrote that night, and I don't know why Ben Moss or Tony Angiola didn't tell me this, but the report he wrote that night said in it, 3 people called the police department to say they had seen the object in the sky. So here is confirmation
Wow.
on that night, prior to there being any kind of publicity about the sighting that these people could have known about, because it happened before Lonnie Zamora called in and have about the landing. That would have been a valuable follow-up. But now 50, 60 years down the road, I can't follow up on it because they didn't write down the names, and nobody said to the police department, let's go out and look for these people now, that it could provide us with some valuable information, corroboration to what Lonnie Zamora saw. But I mean, the point is, I invited the guys on the program. I was challenging what they said. And then I went to do further research based on what they said and learned some very astonishing things. And that evolved into the book, Encounter in the Desert, which talks in depth about the Lonnie Zamora case. But it wasn't that a hostile environment. I was simply asking questions and trying to get answers for those questions that led us to that. So that's an example of people coming on the program and still asking the tough questions that leads to very satisfactory answers.
But there are YouTube channels out there that have many whistleblowers on them, right? And sometimes you don't get to see their face very well, or you do, but there's no, it's just done in such a way where the right questions or the questions being asked are just not really getting into, well, where's your documentation? Prove who you are. Do you know what I mean? And I think there's also many cases of faked interviews. I'm going to say with whistleblowers, where it's just done to get the views, to get the money from having high views. I don't think it's true. Some of them. And what does that do you think, to the UFO industry to fake an interview with someone who's not a whistleblower, where you've got an actor that's being paid to be on the camera to be a whistleblower?
That destroys your credibility by participating in that. But it also splashes mud over the entire UFO community, because people will remember that. The example I like to use is Bill Buckner. In, I think, Game 6 of the World Series, the ball went between his legs, and the other team won and eventually won the World Series. Had he stopped the ball and stepped on the base, the outcome of the World Series would have been different. Nobody remembers all the great things he did. They remember that one thing because it destroyed their World Series run. And that's the way it is in ufology. You catch one person lying about something and it taints the whole case. And we look at the Roswell case and we have any number of people who lied about it, and they say, well, I don't believe the Roswell case because so-and-so was caught out being a liar. That doesn't destroy all the rest of it. It was just that they remember the one guy who was proven to be a liar or proven to have faked part of the stuff, and they remember that, and they use that to taint the entire case without looking at the vast body of evidence. Roswell isn't really a great example of that, simply because there is so much out there about it. But you see some cases where a single person can destroy the case simply by telling a lie, and people discover that lie, and it splashes mud over the entire case. You have to look at it in that, I guess, that context.
I think in the future there will be a lot of these YouTube channels that are out there that have got high viewership, talking about whistleblowers. A lot of shit will come because it is, none of it is true. Half of it, maybe a fraction of it's true. And
I don't think the people who subscribe to those channels care.
No, it's entertainment.
They're there for the good story, and they want to believe.
It's entertainment. But there's nothing wrong with entertainment, is there?
No, there's nothing wrong with entertainment. But when the Discovery Channel got called out for their documentaries on mermaids, because there was a lot of people that believed those stories were true. So that kind of taints a lot of stuff. But I think those YouTube channels that present those people, they get a lot of views and a lot of hits because that's what people want to believe. They want to believe that the CIA is controlling the information. They want to believe that these people are actually doing these things they claim to have done. And if you suggest otherwise, then you're a debunker and a bad person, and I don't want to believe you. They're going to follow this no matter what the evidence suggests to the contrary.
What do you think of people like Tom DeLonge's actions right now in trying to get some authentic information out there?
one in a long line of this sort of thing that's happened in the past. You look at the UFO history, and you can point to other avenues when they've attempted. I think Rockefeller had attempted to do something like that 25, 30 years ago. I know Jalen Hynek talked about once that he'd gotten a call to go to a TV station because the disclosure was going to come out, and we'd all know, which it didn't happen. DeLong has an interest in UFOs and apparently the contacts, not only the contacts, but the money to put himself out into the forefront of the thing. So far, much of what he has talked about is crapola. And on my blog, I actually talked a little bit about this, some of the things that he was saying. I think he's very credulous. He accepts much too much of the ufological literature without kind of filtering it through the evidence, and that I think might hurt him. But he also has some very important contacts, and he's producing some very interesting information, and he's got, for the most part, the legitimate media talking about UFOs rather than making fun of it. Although last night on Fox News, I did see them, and I'm pretty sure it was actors making fun of the whole thing. The only thing they weren't wearing were the tinfoil hats to make themselves look really silly. But I think he has an opportunity here to at least instill some credibility into the UFO field that some of the rest of us may not have because our contacts aren't as robust as his.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much for just for that. And when we, obviously we've been putting your books on the screen. You've done, how many books have you done altogether? Actually, you've done quite a few.
I'm sorry. What was that?
How many books have you written? I
didn't get the whole question.
Sorry. How many books have you written?
Total?
Yeah.
Concluding everything, around 125.
Wow.
Of those, only about a quarter are UFO books. Brad Steiger and I sometimes argue about who's written the most UFO books. He says it's me. I say it's him. And I think Nick Redfern's trying to make a run at it. So he's making a run at that as well. But I've never really intended to write that many UFO books. UFOs were always an interest of mine, and I when Don and I went down to investigate the Roswell case, as we were leaving Roswell the first time, I said to Don, I said, A, we've got to come back, and B, I think there's a book here. And everything kind of grew out of that to all the UFO books that I have done. But I look at it as sometimes there's just a wonderful story to tell. I think, Encounter in the Desert about the Zamora case, there's a wonderful story to tell, and a lot of the information that had been accepted as accurate turns out not to be as accurate as we would have thought. One of the best examples is the number of witnesses. They say, well, it's just single witness, and it turns out, not really single witness. If a good investigation had been done, it would have been a more robust case, but some of the mythology around the Zamora case I was able to dispel in the book.
And just going back to Donald Schmitt, I love that guy as well. He's such a nice guy, Donald is. With Roswell then, what's your take on Roswell all these years later after doing that book?
Boy, I sure don't want to say that because Roswell in the 21st century gives my answer, and so people would have to go out and buy the book to find that.
Okay.
However, that's really not fair. The case is nowhere near as robust as we once believed it to be. An awful lot of the witnesses that we counted on as being truthful turned out not to be truthful. A lot of the information is secondhand. And I'm sure the people who are providing the secondhand information are relating as accurately as possible the information they have, but that doesn't mean it's true. We have an awful lot of secondhand information. There are other things going on about that. In Roswell in the 21st century, I spent a lot of time looking at the MJ-12 documents, which supposedly validate the Roswell case, but I think MJ-12 does not do so. I spent a lot of time looking at the Project Mogul explanation, which I don't think works. I looked at the idea of a crash on the plains of San Augustine. I don't think there was one there in 1947. If there was a crash on the plains of San Augustine, it did not happen in 1947. So I looked at all of these things. I tried to put together a consistent timeline of the events and how it all developed, what witnesses we find that were reliable, what stories we could believe. And when we get to the end of the case, we really have no explanation. That does not automatically take us to the extraterrestrial. It just means I have not found a terrestrial explanation that covers the facts. And that's where we are on Roswell. We do not have the craft, we do not have the bodies, we do not have the government documents proving that sort of thing.
But you're not
we
writing
have
it
an
off.
awful lot of very interesting. No, absolutely not. I'm just saying it does not automatically take us to the extraterrestrial.
Yeah,
we have to look at all the body of evidence, but there's no terrestrial explanation that fits all the facts as we have them.
What is wrong with that explanation, Kevin? I don't know. That's perfect. That's perfect. Thank you so much for that. It's great to hear your opinion on that. And one I just want to bring, because I know we're kind of limited time here a little bit, but I just want to bring it a bit closer to my neck of the woods just right now in the UK. We had the Rendlesham Forest here, and a few years ago that kind of blew up actually between Larry Warren and Colonel Charles Holt, where they have very different stories on that nowadays. And there's been a right nastiness within that camp as well.
Rendlesham Forest? I'm not familiar with that. No, I'm just kidding. I actually had Holt on my radio program twice to talk about this. I have a taped interview that was conducted by Peter Robbins. I think he conducted it, he recorded it between Larry Warren and Colonel Holt. They're sitting in the same room talking about the stuff. I've looked at it in depth. I know John Burroughs. I know Jim Pedeston. I know both of those fellows fairly well. And as I said, I've talked to Colonel Holt. Something happened there that is confusing, and there's, I think, still some things that have been unanswered. The one thing I do know is Larry Warren was not a participant. I think he plugged himself, as you talked about Corso, Larry Warren knew some things and he plugged himself into the story. And if it was not for Larry Warren, we may not have be having this discussion, because he was the one that came out and kind of exposed all of this to Barry Greenwood and Larry Fawcett. And had he not done that, we might not be having this discussion. Although I know some of the English researchers, Jenny Randles and Georgiana Brundy, did some work on it as well. And I don't know if Warren kind of inspired that, or they heard from him, or they had gotten rumblings from other quarters. So there's been some very good research done on that. I've got Holt's book sent to me by Rob Zwiatek as a thanking for me for something I've done for him.
Sure.
So I've looked through all of that. So it's a very interesting case. I'm not sure I buy the explanation that has been, was it Clark? What's Clark's first name? It's not Jerry Clark. It's the other guy. The guy in Great Britain who's done some interesting work from his point of view.
David Clark?
David Clark.
Yes.
Yeah, if you say so. I saw a picture not that long ago, supposedly in Rendlesham Forest, of the lighthouse, so that the lighthouse is visible from the point where they were. And so that was kind of intriguing. But I know that there were other things going on. And
Interesting.
So it's an interesting case. But there again, we do not... And then there's the problem. We have Larry Warren, who's kind of contaminated the whole case. And then we have Jim Pedeston, who has revealed more and more information as time goes on that kind of contaminates the case, because you say, well, why didn't you talk about this before? And I know John Burroughs has undergone hypnotic regression, but John Burroughs has been declared 100%, has a 100% medical problem with his the terminology escapes me for a moment. He 100% disabled. That's what it is, based on his exposure to radiation in the Rendlesham Forest. And I think it's the only time the government has admitted, yeah, that's kind of true. So there's some intriguing things about the case. But once again, we have so many divergent personalities involved in it, telling so many divergent stories, some of which are wholly untrue, that it contaminates the entire case.
Do you feel, in all your years of research, that there is a cover-up at the government level with this information? And it's not just the USA government, and we're talking about international governments here. Most governments are covering this up.
Let's talk about Australia for a moment. the Australian Air Force decided to do a UFO investigation a number of years ago. One of the first things they did was contact the U.S. Air Force about it. And part of the Australian investigation was inspired by a book by Don Kehoe. Well, the U.S. Air Force wrote back and said, Kehoe's a liar and a charlatan. You can't believe a thing he says. And that kind of undermined the attitude in the Australian Air Force investigation. So while the Australian government might not have been participating knowingly in a cover-up, they certainly were participating in the cover-up initiated by the Air Force, which was trying to discredit Kehoe. I have looked at an awful lot of cases, and I think in many of the cases where you can allege cover-up, it is really incompetence that is going on there. But I found other things that suggest cover-up. There was Project Moondust, which was ongoing while Project Blue Book was going on, and Project Moondust had a UFO component to it. So you look at all of that sort of thing, and you can say, well, yeah, there is some avenues of cover-up going on. You can see where there were utter lies told by the U.S. Air Force to a United States senator. Again, Project Moondust. Jeff Bingaman wrote to the Air Force and said, is there a Project Moondust? And the Air Force said, no, we've never had a project like that. And when documents were presented that were labeled Project Moondust, that had a provenance, came from the State Department, they said, well, yeah, we had that project, but we never employed it. Well, that's not true either. So yeah, there are elements of a cover-up in there. I just discovered something called Project Horsefly. And I think if you Google Project Horsefly, you're going to find one entry, and it's from my blog, and it's based on documentation I found in the Project Blue Book files, which was was creating two-man teams to go out and investigate UFO sightings, and it began in I think they were putting it together in the 1960s. And so they would go out and investigate the UFO sightings that deserve further investigation. So there's a lot of that sort of going on. So you can say, yeah, there is kind of a cover-up. Yeah, the Air Force kind of lied about it because they feared the publicity. And you can say, well, part of it was just merely incompetence on their part or a lack of attitude caring about UFOs at all.
And, in my head, right, just going back to YouTube, there are so many channels on there now that have exposed footage of not just whistleblowers, but, potential UFO crafts. And, the views on these channels are absolutely humongous, some of them, right? And a lot of it just looks fake. I mean, how can you tell if any of this material is real nowadays that's coming out online, or whether it's just some very clever After Effects stuff?
I had a friend, Russ Estes, I say he passed away a number of years ago, who was a documentary filmmaker. And he created a UFO film. And what he did was make the UFO look so cheesy that nobody would believe it's a real UFO. And he did that on purpose because he didn't want it to show up on YouTube as a real UFO footage. And then he laid it all together like somebody was viewing it in the sky to prove how easy it was to do in today's environment. What you have to look at is not necessarily the video, although there are things you can do in the video to see whether or not it's been faked. Looking at, the pixelization and the gradation of the pixelization tells you whether it's something that's been inserted or not if it's not done properly. But you have to look at the witnesses. Who are the witnesses? Can we interview the witnesses? Are there independent witnesses? What is the documentation that follows that case? So it's not just looking at the video that gives you the answer. You have to look at everything else that would go along in an investigation to determine whether or not it's true or not.
And if all these videos were bloody true, right? Because, I mean, some of these channels are pumping it out every day, right? And if this was true, surely some of these cases would be coming across your desk. I mean, where is ufology nowadays? Has the media lost interest? Where are some of the cases that you're looking at that are more recent?
Well, actually, what I've been doing is working on a book, the Moondust Conspiracy. So I've been looking at older cases, but going through the files, I find interesting stuff in there that hasn't been adequately explored. And it gives you an idea of how the investigations took place and where the UFO field should be based on what should have been done back then. There are some interesting cases out there. The O'Hare sightings, for example, are very interesting.
Of course, yeah.
People send me information about cases. Oftentimes I get cases that happened 15, 20 years ago. as well. But we're looking at all of this, but we're trying to put it into a historical context so we can make the best case we can about this. If something happened tomorrow where the UFO landed in Washington, D.C., and I pick Washington, D.C. simply because I'm sitting in the United States. If I was in Canada, I'd say Ottawa. If I was in Australia, I'd say Canberra. If I was in England, I'd say London. I just do this so you know that I know the capitals of various foreign countries. But I mean, if something like that happened, we would have a different discussion, and the evidence would be there for us to do.
Okay, then maybe I should rephrase that question then. Great answer, but maybe I should have said to you, maybe there's not that many abductions then nowadays, for example. That seems to have died down. Now, has it died down? Is it still going on? Is there just not a media interest there anymore?
It's still going on. I think the interest has gone in other directions. I think one of the problems is two of the main abduction researchers in the United States, John Mack, who you people in England killed. He was hit by a drunk driver, was he a drunk driver? Hit and killed in an accident in England. And Bud Hopkins passed away from cancer. These were kind of the leading lights of the abduction phenomena. So with their deaths, some of the interest in that phenomenon has faded away. There are still a lot of people claiming to be abducted, and there are a lot of people who are doing their abduction research. Ross Estes, Bill Cohn, and I did a book on the abduction phenomena back in 1998, and one of the complaints we had was basically abduction research is what we would call in psychology case study research. Since that book was published 20 years ago, that situation hasn't changed. We suggested they needed to take abduction research to the next level, and they've never done it. They have not done it. So we are looking at it as something that is completely and totally out of date.
Well, there was abduction researchers like as well Dolores Cannon. You must have heard of her work. Dolores Cannon?
No.
Okay.
No.
Mary Rodwell?
Yes.
Yeah. So there are I mean,
yes, but they do not have the international fame that John Mack,
sure.
a David Jacobs, let's not forget David Jacobs, and Bud Hopkins had. And they command, if somebody wants to do a documentary on abduction research, those were the people they went to. Well, those people are no longer around except for...
What happened with Jacobs then?
I think he is... He like me, has become old.
Well, so
and you tend to slow down, but he also has been he has also got involved in a number of sort of nasty infighting amongst his some of his subjects.
Okay, I see.
So,
right, yeah.
But what I'm looking at is the abduction research has taken sort of a backseat to things, and people have realized that the number of people claiming abduction cannot possibly be accurate because the logistical support something like that would require is of such magnitude that it would have been spotted by now, and we would have much better information about it. We've seen.
Go ahead. Sorry.
We have seen terrestrial explanations for many abductions. One of the best explanations is sleep paralysis, a phenomenon we didn't really understand that well 20 years ago. We understand much better now, which is not to say all abductions are a result of sleep paralysis, but that is a core of abductions, and we now understand what sleep paralysis does and what the phenomena that surrounds it is.
So where are the younger UFO researchers? Are you coming across any of the people that are going to take that torch from you and move forward with this work?
No. Rich Reynolds on his blog, UFO Conjectures, a number of years ago is how I met him, was lamenting the fact that we old codgers seem to be dominating UFO research, and he was looking for the younger investigators to come on board and maybe move the investigation off the spot that it was on. And since that time, I haven't seen that. Their interests are in the secret space program. And they get sidetracked into those sorts of things as opposed to where we were when we started in the UFO research. So I think that's kind of diverting some of the interest by the younger people.
That's a shame. That is that is a shame. But I guess it probably will revert back.
Well,
Things that
there is a side issue here that kind of strikes me. And as I was doing research, and Don and I discussed about this, I found Carrie and I discussed it as well. As we were doing the Roswell research, there were side issues we wanted to explore, and we tried to reach out to other investigators to do that sort of thing. But it was stuff that wasn't really exciting. It wasn't going into the field to interview witnesses. It was going through tax records, for example, to find out who owned property, so we could see if those people were still around, and we could chat with them about what they might have seen. But a lot of this kind of drone work, and they're not interested in doing that. They're interested in the more exciting aspects of it. So some of the legwork that must be done to present or to prepare a proper investigation just isn't getting done because it's not exciting. It doesn't offer reward. Even though, you going through a file and you find the document that you've been looking for after hours and hours and hours, and it shows something that you wanted to see, is really kind of a neat eureka moment. People don't want to spend those hours and hours and hours to get to that one little thing. And the best example of this, I spent a year looking for an article about the Robert Willingham UFO crash story that supposedly was printed in 1968. I spent a year looking for that. I asked people in Pennsylvania, because that's where he was from, about that. And they were going to go out and look for stuff, and they never did that. I finally stumbled across it, one paragraph article in Skylook, which was MUFON's publication prior to the MUFON Journal, in March of 1968. That gave me all the information I wanted, but it took me a year to get there. And how many people, not just young people, how many people are going to spend a year looking for that one piece of evidence that will answer the question for you?
Yeah, it's so true. It's so true. But I mean, if anyone watches this is inspired, then what is the best way to get in contact with you? How do people get in contact with you if they want to, move this forward, and they need your help, or they want your, the people like your support for doing it, or just advice?
I always say you can contact me through my blog because it's monitored, which means if you write a post, it doesn't immediately appear on the blog. I read it before it's posted. And if it's to me personally, then I can, but put your email address in it so I can respond to you. Yeah. Because otherwise it doesn't go back to you. But that's the best way to do it. Say, I'd like to talk to you about blah, 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 blah. Here's my email address. Send me a note. And then we can start communicating that way. It won't, your personal information won't show up on the blog because I won't post it.
Now, your latest book, just right now, that's been released for a little while now, I think since last year, maybe it was last year it came out, Encounter in the Desert, the case for the alien contact at, I'm going to pronounce this right, at Sakaro, I think it says.
Socorro, yes.
Yeah, Socorro's a place, it must be then, because I've not had a chance to read this book. Socorro's a place in the desert, is it? Or some small town?
It's Socorro, New Mexico. Yeah. Well, that's where Lonnie Zamora was a police officer.
Right.
So Socorro, so that kind of puts it together. It starts out with the Zamora information and expands from there, looking at all aspects of that particular UFO sighting. And I don't think I think everybody's going to get mad at me about it because of the way it's structured. You think about it. Well, you don't want to write a book for the skeptics, but you don't want to write a book for the believers. You want to write a book that tells the truth. And I think too often, Corso's book that you held up a while ago, it was written for the believers, and they just glommed on it. Yes, this is the best book ever, regardless of where it goes. I try to write the books to provide the best information available and let you make up your mind whether or not you want to accept this story as evidence of an alien visitation, or you want to reject it because we don't have the spacecraft hidden in a hangar in Area 51 type thing. So the book looks at the landing in Socorro, what Lonnie Zamora said, how the investigations developed, other cases that affect our view of the Zamora case. One of the things that had been said, and I'd said it myself, is there's only a single case in the Project Blue Book files where occupants, creatures from the inside, have been seen labeled as unidentified by the Air Force. Turns out there's actually 3. Socorro case being one of them. So we kind of look at those other 2 cases as well. And some of the explanations have been offered for other cases where there were suggestions of occupants as well. So we look at it in putting the Socorro case in the context of other UFO sightings around it and that sort of thing. So it's not just about the Zamora case, but there's a lot of other information in it as well.
And just very briefly, Jess, I know you've kind of explained, just briefly, what is that case? What was the story there, just very briefly?
Lonnie Zamora was a police officer chasing a speeder. He heard an explosion on the outskirts of town. He thought the dynamite shack there had blown up, so he drove over there, and as he crested a hill, he saw an object sitting in an arroyo, a wadi. Can't come up with an English word for it. A little valley.
Right.
That he thought was an overturned car, so he started down there and realized it wasn't a car. He saw two beings outside the craft. When they spotted him, they ran back into the craft, and it took off and disappeared into the distance. That's the case in a nutshell. It's the investigations that took place afterwards that become very interesting, and some of the evidence that we were able to locate, and I say we, I mean me, but Ben Moss, Tony Angio helped, Paul Hardin helped, documentation from Richard Holder, Jerry Clark helped. So a lot of people provided information so that the book would be as accurate as it could possibly be. Ray Stanford also, I talked to him as well. So, about everything you'd want to know about Socorro is in the book, and there's a lot of other stuff that deals with it as well.
Now, we've been putting your books on the screen, like I said before, about 5 or 6 different versions. Of course, all your books are available on Amazon, I believe.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And if you read the book, give us a rating. I mean, tell me what you think about it. Although I'll caution you, read the book before you review it. The Socorro book has one star rating, and it was clear that the guy based it. No, I'm sorry, it's the Roswell book. He based it solely on the title of the book, and he wrote in the review, "Well, science doesn't believe there's any aliens," and I put a comment on it that said, I'll read the book before you comment on it.
Yeah.
If you've read the book, you don't like it, that's fine. Tell me why you didn't like it. If you like the book, please review it, because those things help the writer improve his craft for the next book.
Absolutely. Well, I would say you're highly respected out there, and it's been an absolute honor to have you on, because like I say, it was many years in finally making this happen, because I just couldn't get it. I could have contacted your publishers. Maybe I thought that today. I was like, why didn't I just do that? But it's all good. It's all good. We've made it. The two Kevins have met.
Yes, the publishers would, in fact, have sent the information on to me, and virtually anybody you'd have contacted in the field has my email address. I mean, you could have called Stan Friedman or Don Schmidt or any number of people, and they would have known how to get in touch with me as well.
I tell you what, that's what that's what I'm going to be doing from now on to get people on. I'm not doing it the hard way anymore. But listen, it's such a pleasure to have you on. What would you say then, from all your work? What would you say as a final closure statement? What is like the most important statement you can make to the audience that's after all these years of doing this work?
Follow the evidence. Don't follow the money, follow the evidence. Go where the evidence goes. Don't get persuaded by a story that is fun, a story you'd like to believe. Look at the evidence and go where the evidence takes you.
Perfect. Well, Kevin Randle, just thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, it's been a hoot, as we say in the U.S.
It most definitely has. Thank you.